All right, good afternoon, everyone. Are we ready to roll? Thank you. Thank you, Noah. Maybe just an invitation to just take a pause to drop in. Settle down into the body. Allow Mother Earth to hold us effortlessly. Just to be present here together in this space. And an invitation to set an intention for this session to realize our highest aspirations. And with that in mind, I'm going to introduce Andreas Roepstorff. And I don't actually, I just realized that I actually don't have the information that I usually have for Andreas. So I'm going to have to do some of this by memory, and he can correct me. So I met Andreas many years ago when I was actually a visiting professor at Aarhus University. I think that was the first time we met. And at that time, Andreas is a very unusual combination of someone who does science and anthropology, has actually done the anthropology on science, was at that time director of the Center for Interacting Minds at Aarhus University, and and a lot of his work, I love some of this really fascinating work about the way humans interact at profound levels. Even I love the firewalker work, where the heart rate synchrony of the close audience members and the firewalkers in the Basque Country is just an amazing article. And that is, if you like the sociologist Durkheim, it's almost a kind of proof of Durkheim's theory. So lots of interesting work about how humans interact. That's not just about language, not just about obvious social conventions, but is much deeper than that. And most recently, I want to congratulate him on having rotated out of being provost or at the Aarhus University, which as someone who just rotated out of being a chair, department chair, I can certainly appreciate that. That's something to celebrate. And really looking forward to hearing what Andreas has for us. Andreas is a core member of the Mind and Life Europe, and of course, that's who are our partners for this event. And we'll be following this up with a conversation. Hopefully, Gabor Karshai will have a few thoughts for us. Then perhaps we'll take a break. I see Gabor nodding his head. That's great. We'll have a short break, and then we'll all come together for a final conversation. So, Andreas, take it away.
No. I think it better be here. Yeah. Good. Thank you, John, for this very kind introduction, and thanks to everyone here at Upaya for making this an extraordinary event, certainly for us who are in the room here. But it seems also that the ability to connect to everyone out there in the world that's not virtual, but for real, just in another place, is also working out really, really well. So yesterday, Laura told us about many things, and one of the things she told about was the importance of listening to the place. And I guess something that you out there have not been able to do is to, in a sense, get in touch with the place. And if you haven't been here before, I guess your idea of Upaya is, narrowed to whatever the camera is catching right now. But there is something that's quite remarkable around here, and that has to do with the enormous amount of trees and wood that are everywhere. So maybe this is a good place to begin. There is a lot of talk about right now that we live in the Anthropocene area. That's the idea that humans are now a geological force that shapes the way the world develops. It's a really bad notion for at least two reasons. The first one is that it, so to say, creates the problem that it's trying to deal with, namely that it separates people from everything else and everything else. And the second one is that it's probably not true. I mean, humans are doing a lot of stuff right now, but according to a number of people whose opinion you should trust, among them Natasha Meyer, a Canadian anthropologist, then the kind of stuff that humans do right now is really on the surface of what has been happening at a global scale at a global time. And she says that what has really shaped the world are plants, and in particular trees. So she says we should really think of our times as the Planthropocene, not the Anthropocene. Because if it hadn't been for plants, we wouldn't have any oxygen. And it's really plants that are doing all the work in creating the type of world that we live in. And there are many trees around here at Upaya. And it's as if, in very interesting and very beautiful ways, that the trees are not just out here, they're actually embedded in the very buildings themselves. In extremely beautiful ways, it's actually such that the building is accommodating to the trunks of the trees that gave whatever they gave to be part of this building here. And to me, listening to this particular place here is also allowing oneself to listen in both to the trees outside and the wood inside, and to whoever was so careful in making sure that the buildings were actually accommodating to the tree and not the other way around. So that might be a good place to begin this particular talk. Now, this is also the final talk of the symposium, and I'll try to, in a sense, revisit the title that brought us here in the first place in a number of different instances. It's about world making, sense making, precariousness, connectedness, and cooperation. And I think we have been covering that ground in many different ways. And today I'll try to give some different ways to open up and say, well, maybe precisely connectedness, precariousness, cooperation, world making, and sense making is not so esoteric that it may sound. It's actually something that goes on all the time. And I will begin with a small case study. So as John mentioned, just prior to getting here, I had rotated out of being a head of school, and it meant that the last year I had basically negative research time. It felt as if I got stupider and stupider. And when Joan was trying to push me to write an abstract, I simply didn't have any time to it. And at some point, she was getting quite firm in saying, now we kind of need an abstract. And I wrote her a very rapid abstract saying something like, could something like this work? And she said, well, dear Andreas, thank you. I have done some editing. Maybe I've lost the thread of what you're going to be doing. Forgive. I just did not get some of what you were unfolding. And also, this sounds wonderful. So I thought, I was just coming out of this moment. So I did just minor edits in it and resent it very quickly and said, this is most useful. I've re-edited as below. Is this fitting and understandable? And the answer came very quickly. A few things in bold again, forgive me. I'm just a simple contemplative. And my sense is that the relevance of this needs to be clarified. But still, this feels elusive. I've also made a few edits, and thank you much again, forgive me. I always go to what seems necessary to meet a fragile and fraught world. So I realized that, I couldn't get away with just doing minor edits. So my reply to her was, the project I'll be talking about is called Experimenting, Experiencing, Reflecting. And it indeed runs on iterations. We do something and we do it again. We structure it around 3 phases: design, run, learn. I had obviously just learned something, so here is a redesign. Thanks for the useful learning that prompted it. I hope this answers some of your questions without being too convoluted. And very quickly the answer came, thanks, dear one, you're most gracious to put up with my questions. I am doing small edits. And forgive me. But I still do not get the temporal drift thing, but no matter what, sending my best. Please review and let me know if this is okay. And I said, this is all wonderful. The dialogues are emphatically not purely linguistics. The encounters are a great addition. That was something that was rightly done in the abstract itself. I should have thought of that. But I'm glad that you put up with the time shift case. It's there to bring in the amazing work of Fodena Newman you will see later. And Roshi Johan accepted it and said, thanks for putting up with me. Enjoyed fiddling with the text. And you can say, well, in a sense, I think what we were precisely exploring in that dialogue here was world making and sense making, right? It was precariousness in the sense that now, in the sense that, I had this feeling that it felt as if I hadn't written for a lifetime, but I could see it was really not good and she didn't get it. So I felt in a precarious situation, but it was also a cooperation and it really, I think, ended up being a much better abstract than it started out being. And in the process was kind of a beautiful sense of connectedness unfolding. So in a sense, if this interaction was normal, very productive and firm in its own kind of way, then it was also about world making and sense making and how we co-construct worlds together through collaboration. And that is, in a sense, what I think the most of my talk will be unfolding. And the first thing, or the first aspect that I'll be looking at is a notion what we call sharing perspective. So as John was alluding to, I am an anthropologist with a biology background. At times I've been doing neurophysiology, at times I've been doing brain imaging, I've been doing anthropology of brain imaging. But what I'll mainly be presenting to you today is very much on the experimental side. So I'm drawing on a relatively recent research project that brings together artistic practitioners and researchers of different kinds in trying to construct something together that from the point of view of research looks like an experiment and produces data, and from the point of view of the artist has the qualities of an aesthetic experience or a piece of some sort. And in the project called Experimenting, Experiencing, Reflecting, we are hoping to create something that in a sense bring out both the experimental and the experiential qualities, and in the process creates aspects of reflecting. It's not working all the time, and this is really the first time I talk about it. So I apologize if it's still very rough in the edges, because I'm still getting to know the stories. But I'll introduce you to a few of the things that we have been working with. And our main collaborators in it is a Danish artist, Olaf Eliasson, and his study, and the research group at my research center in Aarhus, and then a number of people that we bring in from time to time. And this first experiment here basically took place at the Tate Modern in London just before the pandemic, where there was a large retrospective exhibit. And inside that, we, so to say, embedded an experiment that we called sharing perspective. And it was really developed by the woman encircled here, Dorte Bjerre Jensen, who is a performer and a dancer, who has developed this as a particular way to deal with art pieces. And the basic idea is to offer kind of a way to interact with each other and with art pieces that in itself has experimental qualities. So Dorte, who was running it here, she would bring people in, make them feel well in their body, and then ask them to explore the exhibit and each find 3 positions that for some reason felt meaningful, including how things felt, what they sounded like, what they looked like. This was what one should pay attention to. And with that idea, one should basically try to move around in the exhibit at what some people call moving at the speed of your attention, in order to see what is it actually that attracts me. And once people had decided on these 3 positions here, then the next challenge was that they would be paired up with someone else, and most often someone they didn't know in advance. And they were then asked to share the positions with a partner in silence, show them how to get into the position, let them take the position, then get next to them and share the position for a minute. And then you move on to the next exchange, to the next exchange, and then one swaps around. So in a sense, it's a very embodied, non-spoken way of saying, well, actually, you can be in this space in a way that turned out to be meaningful for me. It's a very beautiful experience, and it can be done in many different places. And since it was an experiment, it wasn't just about getting people to do it. After that, we had people go through what we called a reflexive interview. This was the first time they talked together, and it was just talking about, well, what had it been like? What people could take it in whatever directions they were taking them. We then gave them some small Polaroid cameras and asked them they could go back into the exhibit and document where they had been. They could make small prints out of it, and we could get those pictures with us. And finally, they were asked to fill out a questionnaire. It took about 5 minutes, and doing the kind of things that you can do in a questionnaire. And overall, we collected 35 responses. Many had experiences with practices such as acting, meditation, contact improvisation. Most were regular museums visitors, and most were with an unfamiliar person. Now, if we look at the kind of, the boring data first, just the questionnaire data themselves, then it turned out that even though some people found it demanding, well, first of all, they found it eye-opening and joyful, and at times slow, but not necessarily easy. And when we asked them to do what psychologists know as rate on a Likert scale, say on a scale from 1 to 10, how much did you like it? Well, then it turned out that people really loved it. The overall experience was, 9.5 on a scale to 10. Both the first part of it, you can say the experimenting part, were very highly liked. But even the reflecting part, like talking about your experience, revisiting the position with a camera, or even filling in a questionnaire, was rated at 7.8 on the scale, on a scale to 10. Quite unusual for something like that. And our take on that is that there was something about, in a sense, revisiting the experience that became a meaningful addition to it, even if it was just answering these questions. And the final question was, would you recommend it to a friend? And then everyone said yes. So what I will do next is then to try to share with you some of the interview data that we got from this year. And again, you can say this is really just an invitation to try to be in space, in your body, but in places where your body wouldn't usually go. And here was someone that said, well, it was beautiful. It was like discovering secrets somehow, looking at things that sometimes we would pick the same places, same time, same everything, but looking into things that you wouldn't discover by yourself. And the partner said, well, yeah, it's a very intimate feeling. I was paying a lot of attention to your body language as well, trying to, even when we were walk like you. And after having shared my perspective, I had the anticipation. I was excited to know that you would say, well, oh, you found this position too, but you found it in a slightly different way or the other way around. Or someone would say, well, it wasn't only seeing it, but it was taking the same physical position as the other person. That was just completely different. And one would say, well, a lot of times when I saw you start, I was thinking, oh, that's nice and simple. And then I'd eat my words every time, because I'd see how you'd position yourself. And once you are there, there is a lot more complexity going on. And you had arranged stuff just by positioning yourself. You wouldn't know it looking from the outside. You hate to take that position to see what it was that was quite special about how you had arranged that perspective. So in a sense, this is a very kind of simple, but also clear exploration of the fact that perceiving is embodied, and just shifting your body around in the same space, even so subtly, can be doing quite different and interesting things. One person said, I've never reflected much on the way I experience or move through exhibitions. And the experiment suggested the idea of making this a conscious part of days out with a friend, not just at galleries. And it showed me that this can be rewarding. Another one said, well, it was a beautiful, fascinating experience, which will stay with me. I felt it would be a great thing to do with a friend, to understand them better. And one person said, well, I thoroughly enjoyed participating, and to my delight and surprise, this was someone who wrote us a few days after, just out of the blue, I found that it has had an impact now, days after, as a register, that I'm thinking of exchanges with friends differently, being more aware of what they might have meant and how what I did or said could have been perceived. In short, being more aware. So you can say this experiment was a very concrete and simple-minded exploration of what is it actually like to take someone else's perspective, not in the abstract, but in the concrete, and doing it through particular spaces. Obviously, the art gallery was a brilliant place to do it because there's so much to hang on to, but Dorte and others have tried it elsewhere, and it seems like, in a sense, you don't need the art gallery to do it. What is the transforming piece in this here is just that invitation to share spaces. So the second experiment that I will take you through is, I think, also about world making and sense making, but it does something slightly differently. It goes more focused into trying to find ways of exploring experience and making that experience available or visible to others. And this particular experiment that I'll tell you about here grew out of an exhibit that Olafur did at the Fondation Barrière in Basel called Life. And some of you might have been in Basel. The Fondation Barrière is a wonderful kind of exhibit space just outside of the city. And what they did for this particular thing here was that they completely separated the idea between the inside of the museum and the outside of the museum. So normally you would be looking at large glass windows. They were taken out. And instead the inside and the outside were floating together, suspended in kind of water that had a green substance that came alive to it. And that space was available night and day. These are just kind of instances of what it looked like. This was during the late phases of the pandemic. And there was this kind of eerie instance of green and space and inside and outside floating together with that notion of life, in a sense, that framed what this exhibit might be about. And inside that exhibit, my colleague, Katrin Hyman, did what is called a microphenomenological intervention. And microphenomenology is quite a particular way of asking into people's experiences that many people in these environments have worked with. Claire Petit-Mangeon, a French philosopher, are one of the people that has really been pushing it forward. And the idea in this interview is to try to be as precise as possible in allowing people to enter into one particular moment and just keep asking about, well, what did you actually experience here? What was happening? How was it opening up? And I've both been doing interviews, I've been interviewed, and I've seen other people be interviewed here. And something quite remarkable goes on in this approach here. When you're interviewed yourself, one discovers that just this particular tiny moment seems almost to have a fractal nature. The moment you enter in there, it just keeps opening up and keeps opening up and keeps opening up and becomes available in ways that it wasn't at first. And to a listener and also to the people experiencing this, this can in itself be a very deep experience because, again, one becomes aware of stuff that was there, but in a sense wasn't there because one wasn't aware of them. And the instruction that Katrin gave people was to, people had seen the exhibit before, and she said, well, I invite you to revisit this exhibition and follow some simple instructions to allow for a fresh experience. First, find the place where the exhibit starts for you today. When you have found it, take a deep breath, become aware of yourself, relax, and then turn your attention to your attention. Experience and move through the space while asking yourself, is there something that interests me today? Anything that draws me towards it? It can be anything, a perspective, a plant, a shadow on the wall, a thought related to the experience. The only important thing is that it is interesting to you. If you don't find anything, that's fine too, but spend a bit of time looking for it. And if you do find something, stay with it for a few minutes, explore it a bit. What do you see, hear, taste, smell, feel? Does it make you think something, imagine something, remember something? If your experiences come to an end, please come back to me. Please do not bring me your mobile phone. So as an outcome of this particular thing here, Catherine, in a sense, created. So this is the overlay of the building, and each of these dots here represents a space where someone said, well, this was where my experience was based. So in a sense, there is a website that one can go in and explore. And if you click at one of these points here, a narrative about what did a particular person experience in this particular space here opens up. And I'll just kind of indicate a couple of these instances here to give you an idea of what is it actually that you see coming from this. And again, these people were not, highly trained meditators or observers of art. It could have been you or me or anyone else. It's something that just seems to open up the moment that you're doing it. And one person was giving a narrative about, I was sitting on the edge of the bank on that small footbridge, bent over the water, because I had just seen a newt and I was wondering if I would spot it again. And then I was distracted by two visitors who came very close to me. The closer one stumbled a bit and the other said in French, watch out, otherwise you will fall into the artwork. I had to laugh out loud because it was such a pleasing statement. I mean, you don't often encounter the situation where you might fall into a work of art. There is something appealing about it, and it reminded me a bit of my own family. But then again, there was that other voice in my head, the one that doesn't stop asking, what is art after all? And what happens when you don't ask this question? I mean, would they actually fall into an artwork or simply into the water? And here is another one who said, well, I see this, and you can see the dot indicates that the person was in that corner looking inwards. I see this hidden or forbidden, in any case, not accessible room. It is mysterious, slightly scary. Memories come up. A childhood memory first, and then a later memory, the memory of my father dying. I'm holding his hand, feeling the heat slowly leaving it, or his last panting, and then the fear that the warmth is going away. What does this mean, this ending? I'm asking myself this question. I mean, it is the radicality of not knowing, the last and biggest mystery, and it is coming closer now also as I grow old. And in a sense, the space and the website are full of these kind of incredibly meaningful experiences that someone had in there as a way of opening up that space. And you can see here in this particular way here, the experiment is about trying to find ways to actually elicit and make available to others the type of experiences that something like this brings about. Not that it is there in the first place. It's actually quite often only in the period of doing the interview that you become aware of these particular things here. But it leaves like a completely other dimension to what are you actually doing in here. And that's quite interesting that it seems like in a lot of these situations, even just opening up for a situation where one accesses the experiences, bring them out into the open, can be quite transformative in its own right. So the third experiment that I will talk to you about, and this is something that's still ongoing, so we really don't have much data about it yet, but that's the one that Roshi John really didn't like, because it was about mapping different forms of time, as I wrote in my abstract. It was about transmitting futures and sharing memories. And I must admit, when I first came across it, I didn't understand it either. At some point, there was a young artist who knocked on my door and said, I would like to write a PhD. I would like you to be your supervisor. There is a deadline in a week's time. I have the project ready. It's about memory, but it's about memories of sustainable futures. And I had no idea about what a memory of a sustainable future would be like. But I really liked the energy she was bringing in. So I thought, yes, come on, we will try to make sure the university will approve of your application. And she got funded. And here she is, Helene. And this particular piece here is one that she has right on now in Copenhagen. It's part of an exhibit called Yet It Moves. And the piece is called Carte de Continuunos. So here is Helene, and part of the work is this kind of video presentation that in different ways explores what memory is like. And in very interesting ways, you can move back and forth around the screen, and there are reflections coming onto the wall. And part of what is in this part of what is in the video is a very peculiar French map called Carte du Tendre, or the Memory of Emotions, that came out of a very particular novel from the 17th century, when people were collectively figuring out what would novels look like. We have a colleague, Karin Kukkonen, who is an eminent literary scholar, and she has the idea that at that time, writing novels was not an individual thing. It was collectives who were coming up with a format that ended up with what is it like to write a novel. And part of the way that they did that was that they had a number of games and interventions with each other in order to figure out, how do you describe your emotions? How do you bring them out into the public? And some of the books are really about what are the kind of games that you're doing in order to create those type of landscapes that we now think of as a novel, as that which has been written by one person. And in one of these, the Carte du Tendre, is kind of a map of the emotional landscape that you can go through before you end up in the happy life, possibly. And it has all sorts of interesting and beautiful features that you can look up for. So that's part of the piece. Another part of the piece is a kind of a rendition of the hippocampus, seen here on the right, or Helene's version of the hippocampus, or maybe it's something else as well. It has many different alliterations to it. But as many of you would know, the hippocampus is an anatomical structure that seems to be involved in storing of memory, but also about imagining futures. So at a kind of neurophysiological level, it seems like the present, past, and the future are tied together by the hippocampus, having that ability both to bring the past in, but also to project into the future. And then the final part of this particular piece here are statues of this hippocampus that are placed in different parts of Copenhagen with the QR code attached to it. And if you get onto that QR code, you enter into a website called Carte de Continuones. It's an emotional map in which you're invited to leave behind a memory for the future. And the question that Helene asks, and I think it's a really interesting but also troubling question, is, well, what do you remember that you would want the future to remember? What do you remember that you would want the future to remember? And this is unfolding now. This is what the website, the map, looks like. And the way that people put a memory onto that map, and they can place it wherever they like to, is simply by, as they come up with that memory they want to project into the future, they're giving a small knot that they can place somewhere on the map here. And each of these knots here is like a small memory that can open up. And I think when I last talked to Helena, there was a couple of hundred of these memories that are going online now. And I'll just share kind of a few of them. One was, well, I want the future to remember the feeling of snow, a soft, cold, yet gently touch of the magic of nature. Someone said, I want people to remember a time where people communicated with each other without electronics. Someone said, I want that the art of John Coltrane is the ultimate achievement done by a member of the human species. And then there was one that I simply couldn't find again, but it's there somewhere, and it just said the words Tamagotchi. And if some of you remember, those were these little digital animals that we had to, maintain, otherwise they would die through the hands of you. So we don't know what the outcome is of this map here. Once Helene has been collecting all the narratives over the next couple of months, we'll do some kind of analysis to try to see, well, what is it actually that people would like the future to remember? Do they help us to create kind of a contemporary map of the emotions that you experience and the futures that you envisage or hope for and fear? And how will people be, in a sense, placing that on top of that particular map here? And there are a couple of, you can say, elements in it that when we talk to Helene, she finds it interesting and different from our ordinary practice. Namely, that idea to say, well, you can actually create kind of art situations that are actively inviting the participants to contribute something in there, to leave spaces of attention and care there, and to find ways of, in a sense, leaving traces both behind and also for the future. And what we have found in this piece and in other pieces is that it hardly requires any moderation. It is as if it calls for a certain element of care that means that people take care whenever they leave these statements behind or leave them for the future. But I don't know anything more about it yet because, it's just running now and you can go in and see it at this particular site. So, in a sense, you can say, I think all of these pieces are about precariousness. They're about connectedness and collaboration. They're about world making and sense making. And the final exploration that I will tell you about, and this is a little bit more crazy and all over the place. It's about exploring something that really, I think, touches onto what Adam was talking about in the last example also. Namely, how do we deal with agency? How do we explore what it is like to experience something, to have agency there? And we have been doing it in many different ways. I'll be coming back to it later. But one of the kind of more crazy way that we experience agency is one of my colleagues, Amos Blanton, who is what is called a tinkerer. That is, he's very good at creating situations where people are given simple tools and simple elements, and based on that, they have to build something. And in this particular instance here, what people are given is some kind of a base set that, driven by the sun, can create these things that can do drawings. And then there are all sorts of ways that you can attach stuff to it. And as you attach stuff to it, it starts moving around and it gets kind of a life of its own. And in this particular really, really complex experiment that I described here, we had people working in groups of 2 at, I think, 5 or 6 different tables. Each were given the tools to explore that. And then on top of each of these situations that were complex enough on their own right, there were people like me, other ethnographers, who were looking at what happened at a particular table and could then go from one table to the next table and say, well, over there, they have discovered this thing here. Maybe that would be interesting for you to explore. Maybe you could do something about that. So here is a really complex map, and we can't go into the details of all of it. That just is one attempt at mapping out what happens over time at all these different stations. And I'll just be looking into a particular instance of it. So these were 2 people who quite quickly discovered that whatever their thing was doing required a name. And they decided to call it bonkers, because it was really freaking out. And in their approach of working with it, it became very much a matter of saying, how could they set up the environment in such a way that bonkers could go really bonkers? And that was all about working with mirrors so there would be light for that to pick up, etc. And one of them said, well, its name is Donkers, not just because of what it do, because I also need to work on empathy with machines. And we are trying to help it to be as bonkers as possible, because that's what's in its name. So, they were into one very particular track of what they were doing in this experience of agency with something that started out as inert stuff and then suns and mirrors and other things. There was another couple who took a completely different approach. They, in a sense, their base model was quite feeble. It kept falling apart. And they said, well, this particular guy or girl is not strong enough in other positions. So we have only found one position where it can flourish. And they were then given kind of a replacement so they could do something else, but they didn't want to do that. So instead, what they did was that they found ways of using the new model to support the model that they already had ongoing. And they were then given the idea that, the people over here, they gave their device a name, they called it bonkers, and they looked at theirs and said, well, that's not bonkers, it's something completely different at stake. It's a very different entity that's unfolding here in front of me. And what they were doing then was they started working with mirrors in order to try to get that to unfold what they perceived to be the agency in it. And in the next instance of it, something very interesting happened, that by cross-fertilizing across these different instances, someone then came up with the idea that you could actually place a mirror on one of these agents and then let that mirror be reflecting the light onto another thing. So they were creating, so to say, interactions between different agents that were talking or doing stuff with each other. That's where they were moving about the space here. And this is what we describe on the left hand in one particular instance of it. So are they alive? No, I don't think any of us would say that they are alive, but there was clearly that idea that somewhere in that process, some kind of agency was happening, and people felt and took responsibility for what does it actually take to allow this agency to unfold and to help shaping not just the entity, but also the world around it as this was unfolding. And I think, in a sense, this is one instance of what we have been discussing again and again here, namely that there is something about that ability to shift from motions of, humans have actions and the rest of the world is dead, onto saying, well, how can we actually nourish and make visible the type of connections that allow us for stuff to unfold in very interesting ways. And that particular workshop was about, well, one of our themes, our research theme was about what we called perspective taking in a sense of we-ness. We were here very interested in, well, what would it be like to take a perspective from something else than a human being? And then one of the small experiments was basically, as you can see in the middle, about placing rocks. So people were sitting around this tray here with rocks, and each person had to place a rock one after the other in that particular space where it felt meaningful. And if you do this exercise collectively, at some point it becomes extremely precarious, and it feels like you can hardly put another stone there, and it feels as if other people are doing something to the configuration that can destroy it or bring it into other places. So even though there are just stones and intentions in there, that thing in the middle, in a sense, gets an agency or some kind of action that you draw on and shape for yourself. And I think this is precisely a notion of this. And the experiment we have on the right was initiated by a Danish theater person who is also the person in Denmark who got the permission from the Danish state to reinstall the Norse religion officially. This, in Denmark, being a highly regulated society, you can apply to the ministry, say, we are a religion, and you have to fulfill schemes to prove that you are a religion. And if you do that, you can, if you do it right, then you're granted the right to marry people, etc. And she did that. So you can say she was reenacting traditional Nordic knowledge, or maybe she wasn't. There were people who tried to, at some point, create the spaghetti monster religion, and that was rejected for reasons that I don't quite understand. But in this particular exercise here, which was a very beautiful exercise, we were all invited to try to become grass. A very simple and beautiful exercise. And what you can see here is just a lot of people standing upright with that feeling of, well, what if actually my feet were roots? And my body are grass, and everyone else are here. And how do you stand in that particular space? So I guess what we are seeing from these experiences is it doesn't take radical changes to actually create these situations where suddenly agency can be felt as meaningful in very different ways. It can be embodied, it can come meaningful things out of it, and it allows for exploring different forms of relations. So what I've tried to do here, and this is the abstract that I hope is now clearer now that I've shown what we were trying to do, is that the interventions that I've been trying, I think we try to outline spaces of experiencing that are delineated by playful and reflective experimenting. They are playful in the sense that they make it possible for an action to unfold in situations where uncertainty and unpredictability are embedded in a relatively safe framework and setting. And we have done quite a bit of work on play, and we can talk about that in the discussion, but there's something about play that seems to be about kind of a setting of frame. Already Bateson, that we heard about previously, has been describing this dogs almost bowing to each other before entering into a fight that's a playful fight, to indicate that now a bite is not a bite, but a sign of the interaction, and then you can go out of it again. And there seems to be something about creating that framework where actions become something else that are important. And in our interpretation of, well, what does it play do, is that it's a corrective to the idea that organisms are all about reducing uncertainty and being in predictable worlds, because the playful universe seems to be one where, in a sense, you expect surprises to happen, but in such a way that you can actually deal with them. And that seems to be precisely what's being done here. But it takes these very safe settings actually to allow you to enter into that form of precariousness in a productive kind of way. They're also experimental in a kind of more classical sense, in that they attempt to document the unfolding processes using various approaches. And then we try to make them reflective in that we aspire for this documentation and analysis to be folded back into the experiment and integrated into the experience. And it seems, at least and this is a PhD student working with us, that says that in very interesting ways, I mean, reflection and surprise works well with each other, because if there has been no surprises, there's really no need to reflect. Right? A reflection exercise with no surprises is meaningless. A lot of schools' reflection exercises are about that. But it seems where you need the reflections to come in are actually in those situations where something is not solved. And the reflection, once you allow that to do that, can create those spaces that actually bring you further. And in our experience, they offer, we think, ways to explore forms of interaction and sense-making, where gentle invitations to experiment open experiential spaces that call for reflection. And we hope that such experiments allow one to experience per se, and also discover that these processes of sense-making and world-making that can seem very abstract, that they are really, I mean, they're embodied. You shift your body around, other things are happening. They are informational also, in the sense that a lot of it is about being invited to look at things in particular ways. This is a radical part of what it is like to do these processes, that someone can invite you or tell you or say, try to do it like this. They are collaborative, and they're also dialogical, just as Roshi Joan was doing with me as we started this very particular session here. And at least we are kind of playing with this idea that this experience here may not be the worst preparation for precarious times. Thank you.
They're fantastic, Andreas. Really wonderful to hear about this work. Brings up a lot of thoughts for me, at least. And hopefully the abstract is clear now, Roshi. But yes, Roshi said, since she wrote it, yes, it's clear. So I'd like to turn, if we could, Noah, if we could get Gabor there from our online participants, and just give Gabor a few minutes to reflect or to pose some questions. So take it away, Gabor, when you're ready.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, John. I hope you are hearing me well. It's nice to see you, Andreas.
We're just working on sound, Gabor. 1 second. Sorry, just hold on a second. We need to make a switch over on the sound here.
Sure, no problem. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. So nice to
yes.
So nice to see you, Andreas, over there. It was a fascinating talk, and I saw many threads in your experimentation that we heard from previous presentations. We heard about precarity, we heard about listening, we heard about narratives, we heard about word making in digital times. So it was beautifully exemplifying all the previous talks. But I would like to offer a linguistic analysis to share my understanding of what you are doing and why it's significant. And the linguistic analysis goes back to trying to understand the etymology behind the two words that you used, experimenting and experiencing. They come from the same Latin root, the Latin word experire, meaning trying or even tempting. So it's very interesting that the word experimenting, meaning trying, doing something that is new, something that I haven't tried before, and experiencing comes from the same root. Experience is actually based on experimenting. I could even rephrase Descartes' cogito ergo sum and say that instead of cogito ergo sum, experior ergo experior. I experiment, therefore I experience. Or if we want to do it in a Buddhist way, we could say there is experiment, therefore there is experience. And we can even extend that to the, I would say, universal level that Adam was talking about, looking for agency, not only in living organisms, but I would say agency in stars even, agency in the whole universe. The universe is experimenting. trying out things, therefore experiencing things. And Adam was referring to Wheeler, and one of my favorite articles from Wheeler is Law Without Law, where law is not something that is pre-existing in the universe. Law is becoming in the process of unfolding of reality. Law is becoming law through experiments, and law is becoming experience, basically. Finally, I would just would like to give another linguistic little etymology to the term precarity, because it goes very well with trying. Precarity comes from the Latin prex, and prex means prayer or entreaty. So precarious means obtained by entreaty. Precarity means that which is obtained by entreaty, where prayer is needed. So we embark on a journey. We go out in an environment that is precarious by saying, I hope the move I make is going to lead somewhere. I hope the move I make is going to bring some meaning. I hope that the experiment I'm going to make is going to be successful, or going to bring something new or something meaningful. So experiment and experience is based on trials and errors. It's not simply, experience is not simply passive that is happening to us, but it's not active in the sense of having a self doing it. So it's also no self, but we can't say that there is self or no self. It's something in between. We can't say that there is a free will or determinism, but something in between. And that's why, and that's because the universe in itself is open and precarious and experimenting and experiencing at the same time, having agency all over the place. I just wanted to share this reflection with you as an inspiration that I got from your very beautiful talk and the experiments and the experiences and the reflections you were sharing, Andreas. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gabor. This is, I didn't know that. And even if I had known it, I probably wouldn't have thought of it. So this is really useful. And I always thought that the closeness between the two were something, but I had no idea that they were etymologically connected, and the precarity and precariousness adds another angle to it. There is kind of one of my, I wouldn't say favorite philosophers, someone that I keep returning to is someone that has a really bad press, namely Popper. And Popper had a book that says all life is proper. There is a philosophy of biology in Popper that is not very well known, and not many people are doing something about it. That's also, in a sense, exploring that, trying out stuff in the world as something that life is constantly doing. And maybe that's a critical part, and it ties into a similar domain to what you're describing there. I guess what we struggle the most with is to figure out, how do we place reflection and reflexivity into that picture? Because we can see that this is an important part of it. It's an important part of our own practice, that it shapes us as researchers and as artists. Once we enter into that collaboration, that interaction does something to our understanding of ourselves, and it also seems to do something for some of the people that participate in it. But it's very difficult to, in a sense, come up with a model or with an understanding of what is it actually that language allows us to do when it is meaningful, right? What is it that reflection can do that suddenly allows for a reconfiguration, both of past, present, and future, and that allows for a redirection of it? And I think before we have that brought into the picture, so many of the ways that we work with understanding the mind or understanding human interaction are really not getting anywhere. And most of kind of classical psychology and classical experimental work, there is no space for precisely that element there. Anthropology doesn't have the same problem with it in many ways, but that has a troubled relationship to it, because reflection in many of those traditions becomes very navel graveling. It's a matter of thinking about myself, and myself. But here, I think what we see in these interventions, or whatever we call them, is that when reflection is meaningful, it's actually adding something to the world that leaves a trace that follows you afterwards. But understanding what that is and how to bring it about, I think, is critically important.
Thank you, Andreas. I'm wondering if Amy would also like to share some reflections.
Yeah, great. That would be wonderful.
Yes, Amy.
Well, I was blown away by your talk, Andreas. I thought it was really fantastic. And one little thing I could add that goes very well with Gabor's etymological reflections on experiment and experiences is that the other root that's in that word is the per, P-E-R root, which is an Indo-European, I think, or maybe even Sanskrit. You could answer that, probably, John, that gives us the word peril. So whenever you are in a position of really experimenting, experiencing, you're putting yourself at risk. So in fact, the precariousness is enfolded into the experiment. So I think that that's also an interesting
that's beautiful
reflection on that. And
Thank
otherwise, lots of other things to say, but maybe we can leave it for the end of, I think particularly there's a lot of things to say, perhaps in relationship to inaction and in relationship to many of the other things, including spiraling time and Melissa's talk about this notion of iteration and reiteration and reflexivity. And maybe that also can be linked up to the question of semantics that Adam beautifully brought in. So
I have a suggestion. I think I hear that you have a lot more to share. So I think maybe, Roshi, we should take a 10-minute break and set ourselves up here to bring the group together. And we can even start out with something from Amy and then have a conversation with the group or with everyone. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
thank you so much, Andreas.
And also, just quickly say, fantastic from Gabor and as well. Thank you very much. So we'll pause for about 10 minutes, Roshi, and we'll get set up here, and we'll see you all then.